Oh, I am C.A. Brill, author of Why Christians Should Oppose Christian Nationalism. In this series of videos, I am going over Christian nationalism as an idea, looking into its definition, and bringing forward some biblical exegetical arguments against Christian nationalism. Last time we talked about the definition of Christian nationalism, and now that I have put forward a coherent, positive definition to the idea of Christian nationalism, I believe it is important to make some qualifications. That is to say, there are certain ideas that are similar to Christian nationalism, or that some people might even call Christian nationalism, but that do not fit into the category of Christian nationalism as it has been defined. But before I get into that, I will say that if you'd like to follow along, the book is linked in the description here on YouTube. And if you would like to help further this conversation, feel free to like and share this video on social media. If you'd like to catch up with future episodes, feel free to subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments section below, even follow-up questions. And at the end of the series, I will have a question and answer segment answering relevant questions about the book and about my opinion on Christian nationalism. So anyway, now that that's through, let's get right into the ideas that I'm talking about. So anyway, there are several ideologies that people might describe as Christian that are necessarily excluded from the category of Christian nationalism. So let's move on from there. By necessity of the definition, several ideologies that seek to affirm the Christian faith are excluded from the category of Christian nationalism. Among these are Christian federalism. And what is Christian federalism? Well, Christian federalism is an idea that the Christians, rather than taking control of a whole state and implementing Christian principles on the level of a whole government, they instead take control of subdivisions. And rather than having a centralized method of enforcement regarding Christian virtues, which I'm certain that Christian nationalists desire, Christian federalists instead have a more decentralized approach. So another form of Christian ideology is dominionism. Dominionism is the idea that Christians need to take over political institutions very positively, and that, while some people might say it has some similarities to Christian nationalism, it is not necessarily the same. Another one is ecclesiocracy. What is ecclesiocracy? It is when the ecclesia or the church becomes the governing body over a society, and that is not the same as Christian nationalism. Pillarization. So pillarization is an idea that, if you're familiar with the ideas of the Dutch theologian and politician Abraham Kuyper, pillarization is a system wherein different religions in a society and different religious communities exist in parallel and develop their own distinct and separate institutions that operate in parallel without having authority over each other. Sacralism. Sacralism is a term that's used to describe an idea wherein the civil magistrate is told by religious authorities to enforce certain religious virtues in society, and this also typically involves religious uniformity. And once again, this is not necessarily the same as Christian nationalism. Theonomy. Theonomy is a system wherein the Old Testament law, or at least, as many would say, the general equity of the moral law, as seen in the law of Moses, is politically implemented and applied to society. And that is yet another type of Christian governmental model that does not necessarily coincide with Christian nationalism. And there are many other ideologies that are neither rooted in the concept of popular sovereignty of the nation. And this concept of popular sovereignty is a concept that is positively applied in nationalism, but not necessarily in these other ideologies. While it is true that some adherents of these ideologies have occasioned to call themselves Christian nationalists, and that the particular elements of these may be combined with Christian nationalism with varying consistency. So I acknowledge that, for example, a theonomist is not necessarily a Christian nationalist, but a theonomist can theoretically choose to be a theonomist and a Christian nationalist simultaneously. However, all these different ideologies may or may not be compatible with Christian nationalism to varying degrees. Therefore, it is a falsehood to call an ideology nationalist if it is not obligatorily so. So if you say that theonomy is the same as Christian nationalism, if you say that dominionism is the same as Christian nationalism, that is not true. And as I said before, it is very important for Christians to uphold the truth, and it is dutiful for them to uphold the truth in the matter concerning Christian nationalism. So I'm going to read in Proverbs 12:17 through 22. If you'll just give me a moment to pull up the text. He that speaketh truth showeth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. So I'm not trying to misrepresent Christian nationalists. As such, I am not equating them to any of these other ideologies. And likewise, they themselves should not seek to misrepresent themselves or those other ideologies, and therefore they should not equate them. If there's a combination, then let them describe the combination. There is that speaketh lie, the piercings of a sword. But the tongue of the wise is health. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. And that's why it's so important to establish these categories and to make clear and coherent definitions, because if you misrepresent someone, then you might attribute a position that that person does not hold to that person. And in doing so, when we're talking about politics, as I said before, there's the matter of the sword. So there is an element of force and violence, and you don't want to accuse somebody of wrongfully wanting to do something when that person doesn't actually have any desire to do something. So it is very important to not misrepresent these ideas in order to be accurate and to not bear false witness against a brother or against your neighbor or against anybody else. So we should not be making false accusations. And in order to not make false accusations, we need to really delve into the definition. And that, I believe, is something that is supremely important when discussing these matters. So anyway, moving on from there, when we are talking about Christian nationalism, there are other things that are necessarily excluded, including those nationalists who, while affirming the faith, make it secondary to another national identity. To them, Christianity is only a mere accessory to a differing form of nationalism, as they are simply nationalists who happen to be Christians or who value some elements of Christianity that is beneficial in service to their ideology. Therefore, because their Christianness is not what organizes their nationality, they should properly be excluded from the category of Christian nationalists. So what does this mean? Well, if you are, let's say, an American nationalist, but Christianity is merely something that's an addition to that rather than the central element of that position, then it is necessarily true that I would argue that it would not be appropriate to call such a person a Christian nationalist. You might call him an American nationalist with Christian characteristics, an American nationalist who is a Christian, an American nationalist who thinks Christianity is important. But saying Christian nationalist should imply something much deeper in connection with the Christian faith. Because if there is a different term that you can put next to the word nationalism that more accurately describes your position, then you should be using that term instead of the term Christian. And therefore, this is very important for the accurate representation and for ensuring that the category of Christian nationalist is properly restricted to those who actually see Christianity as central to their idea of nationalism. Anyway, moving along from that topic, a third category of those excluded consists of those who are, in their nationalistic zeal, have made Christianity subordinate to their nationalism. So we have people that are nationalists and Christians, but Christianity is not central to their nationalism. And now we have people that are more nationalist than they are Christian. These go so far as to love their earthly nations more than they love God. And I think that's a very important point here, that I'm only talking about people that do this, people that love something more than they love God, which of course is a big problem. In the case of some of the more extreme ethno-nationalists, and if you don't know what an ethno-nationalist is a nationalist who bases nationalism upon ethnicity. And if these ethno-nationalists, or at least the more extreme elements of these, love their nationality more than they love God, then they are what would be referred to as race idolaters. By that I mean that idolatry is, of course, idol worship, but if you make something more important than God in your worldview, in your paradigm, then that can become an idol to you. And therefore, if your race is more important than God to you, then you are a race idolater. Now, I'm not talking merely about people who are just run-of-the-mill racists. I'm talking about people who love their race more than they love God. And that is a huge problem. And the Lord has repudiated this attitude, as I will demonstrate. I will look at Luke 14:26. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now, this doesn't mean that you should hate your family and want to kill your family. That's not what it means. What it means is that you need to love God more than you love your own kinsmen, and even more than you love yourself. Because if you love yourself more than you love God, if you love your kinsmen more than you love God, then you're putting someone else to be more important than God in your life. And that is something that should definitely be avoided. Another passage I'm going to be looking at is Matthew 7:21 through 27. And not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name have done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And every one that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So God here needs to be at the center of this. So, and here we see in verse 24, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them. So you need to hear what Jesus is saying, and you need to obey what Jesus is saying. Otherwise, you end up constructing your faith, and you end up constructing your life, and you end up planning for your future in a way that will not stand the test of time. Just like how when there's people that then expect to enter into the kingdom of heaven, but then God says that they should have done his will. They did not do the will of the Father, and therefore although they did things that looked like very faithful things, like prophesying and casting out devils and doing many wonderful works, they did not receive the right to enter into the kingdom of heaven because they were not obedient to the will of the Father, and therefore they were cast away as sinners who did not receive redemption. And so what does this mean for people who put their ethnicity above their faith? This means that they will not be able to make it unless they repent and unless they put God at that number one spot. Because through this action that they have done, they demonstrate that God is not loved by them fully because they love other things more than God. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that you can't love other things, because the degree to which you can love God is something that can grow and it ever grows. Just like how in a marriage, your love can start at one place and it has plenty of room to grow and to mature. And likewise, if there are so many ways to love God and so much room to grow to love God, there's also so much room to grow to love your neighbor and to love your family, etc. So I'm not condemning the act of loving other things. However, it is very important to look at God as the center of all things when we are understanding this. So the Lord has repudiated their attitude because they have preferred their earthly disobedience over the love of Christ and the unity found in his body. So I'm going to be reading Colossians 3:1 through 15. If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth: fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence. I really stumbled over my words there. Inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. For which things sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience, in the which ye also walked sometime when ye lived in them. But now ye also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man and his deeds, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. Put on therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to the which also ye are called in one body, and be ye thankful. So therefore, what am I trying to emphasize here? The love of Christ. Christ gives us life, and we need to not only be concerned about earthly things and our earthly nations, but we also have to be concerned about, and perhaps even more concerned about, our relationship with God. And we need to put away various sinful attitudes and sinful actions that are idolatry, even. And I think it's very interesting here that Paul is equating all these various types of sinful actions, and he goes to covetousness, and he says that that is idolatry. So there you go. But beyond this, he goes even further, and we see that in the context of the church, in the context of the unity of the body of Christ, we have neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. So if you put the unity that you have is as an ethnicity or as a race, and you put that above the unity that you have in Jesus Christ, then I'm just saying you're doing something wrong. Because we are called to be in one body. And for that, I am really thankful that I can call fellow Christians all over the world my brothers. That doesn't mean that politically we break down all of our barriers and move around everywhere and do all various things. That doesn't mean that at all. But what it does mean is that the bond that I have in Christ is stronger than any bond of blood or soil, because it is something that is eternal, something that is built for the kingdom of heaven, and that will outlast those other things that are merely earthly. So there you go. But anyway, I shall continue. Therefore, by reducing the faith to a tool that is malleable to their ends, the race idolaters and other groups that fall into similar errors are excluded from the category of Christian nationalists. So you heard it here first, okay? All the people in the media saying white nationalism is a type of Christian nationalism, that there's white Christian nationalists. That's not true, okay? And I can tell you that although some Christian nationalist writers do make emphasis on ideas of cultural unity and of common heritage, they do not have the attitude that their nationalism comes above their Christianity. They do not have the attitude that their race and ethnicity is more important than their unity in the body of Christ. Therefore, as it is essential for Christians to follow God before anyone else, and therefore Christianity being essential to the idea of Christian nationalism, people who subvert their faith in favor of something else are not properly called Christian nationalists. And there you go. I've actually had to defend Christian nationalists in some respect here against what I consider to be a perfectly invalid criticism. A criticism that goes beyond what is appropriate to the definition of Christian nationalism. So anyway, let us move on from there. The next thing I want to talk about is that there are some who claim to be Christian nationalists and have responded to their critics by drawing spurious conclusions that their opponents must, through their rejection of Christian nationalism, be supporters of pagan nationalism, Christian liberalism, or Christian globalism. But these accusations are typically presented in the form of a dichotomy between Christian nationalism and only one other less desirable position. And this is something that I've seen. I'm not going to name names because I think people that have done this know who they are. But I hear this when people say, well, we don't want Christian nationalism. And this person says, well, what do you want? Pagan nationalism? What do you want? Christian liberalism? Well, Christian globalism? You don't want to be a nationalist? You want to be a globalist? Okay, I'm going to respond to that here. This cavil suits none so well as these nationalists who, claiming to recover long-held truths of Christian politics against modern corruption, fall themselves into the same errors which they ascribe to their opponents. Why? Why are they falling in the same errors to which they ascribe their opponents? Because liberalism and nationalism are joined at the self-same root of Enlightenment philosophy, which is manifested in the concept of popular sovereignty. That is supported by both of these ideologies. So what does that mean? Well, liberals believe in popular sovereignty because they believe that the people should have a freedom to govern themselves. And nationalists also believe in popular sovereignty, but they believe it in the context of the unity of the nation. And this idea of popular sovereignty is an idea that developed more fully throughout the Enlightenment, which is a period of history that some early parts of it began in the late 1600s, but it mostly occurred throughout the 1700s. And there were many philosophical developments, many ideas that people were bringing out. You have Rousseau, you have John Locke, there's all sorts of different ideas. I'm not going to give you a history lesson on all of this. But the point is that before this, there were different concepts. Before the Enlightenment, you had different ideas about how the people relate to the state and how the government relates to the state and how society should be structured and how political legitimacy is formed. And this all changed with the Enlightenment, with the development of new ideologies like liberalism, nationalism, and of course, socialism. So, but what about globalism? What about globalism? Well, furthermore, today's globalism and nationalism are joined together as parts of a coherent international order by design, as the United Nations Charter assumes the right of a self-determination of peoples in a world characterized by the shattering of the old empires into smaller nation states that cooperate for their mutual benefit through international institutions to compensate for their often ill-conceived political construction. So, what am I talking about here? Well, the United Nations Charter, in the very first chapter, talks about the self-determination of peoples. It talks about the cooperation of various discrete nation states. And this means that the United Nations Charter is written, the United Nations Charter being an important element to what people call globalism, that is to say, the international cooperation and the viewing of the world as a singular system that should operate through cooperation and through interdependence. This is rooted in the idea of nationalism. It is the nationalists who developed the dismantling of many old empires, both the larger, expansive land empires as well as the colonial empires. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there's several empires that operate, and there were many fewer countries back then. So you have, of course, France, Britain, Germany, Austria, or Austria-Hungary after the Ausgleich, Russia, you've got China, the United States counts as an empire, and the reason it counts is not only because of various opinions. You have many of the founders of the United States referring to it as an empire, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton being two examples. The Ottoman Empire, of course, and Japan and others. But then, going through the 19th century, there were the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, wherein the nationalists wanted to overthrow the older royal authorities. And then in the 20th century, you have decolonization. And a lot of the decolonization is guided by principles of the self-determination of people and of popular sovereignty and of the desire to essentially carve out discrete nations and to nation build. And however, a problem arose that not all of these nation states could achieve the same degree of prosperities that they could independent of the previous empires. And as such, they developed a more broader international institutions in order to allow them to prosper better. So in some ways, the nationalists are actually responsible for the development of globalism. Nationalism and globalism could be said to be two sides of the same coin, because nationalism creates the situation that makes globalism a desirable event. due to the dismantling of imperialism, which is a different viewpoint. But anyway, moving on from there, though these apologists of Christian nationalism may be men proficient in matters of the church, so I'm not saying that these people are bad theologians per se, but they have revealed a profound lack of knowledge concerning statecraft through their indiscretion. So I'm going to read Proverbs 17:27 through 28. Oops, I accidentally put a quotation. There you go. He that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise, but he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. What I'm saying is, if you don't know what you're talking about, perhaps you should not say it. Now, that being said, another error in their critique is that, as I mentioned before, there are many alternatives that Christians have developed to Christian nationalism, even before the development of nationalism itself, even before nationalism even became a word in the 1700s. Okay. Because they revealed a profound lack of knowledge concerning statecraft through their indiscretion by ignoring thousands of years of its general history, as well as a greater part of Christian political philosophy, which present, so that is to say, both the general history as well as Christian political philosophy present a myriad of ways to organize states that involve none of the few newer ideologies which they perceive to characterize the whole of political philosophy. So when you treat Christian nationalism as a dichotomy between Christian nationalism and Christian paganism, or Christian nationalism and Christian globalism, or Christian nationalism and Christian liberalism, that's a false dichotomy. There are many other ideologies that exist, and I've mentioned some of them earlier, and you can read thousands of works of political philosophy from thousands of years of history, and many of these may even include Christians. So for example, you have Johannes Althusius, Abraham Kuyper, King James. Some people don't know this. King James was a political philosopher. There's a lot of different people that have written on these topics. And I don't think that there's any excuse for making these types of false dichotomies, for making these superficial arguments that contrast Christian nationalism with only one opposing position, or that essentially are trapped inside the box of Enlightenment ideologies. Nevertheless, while it is true that many contemporary Christians have accepted Enlightenment principles to some extent, it is manifestly incorrect to assume that this is necessarily true of all who oppose nationalism. It would do the Christian nationalists better if a greater number of these apologists, that is, of these people that make these kinds of arguments, engaged with counter arguments more seriously rather than establishing false dichotomies. Worse yet are those who deny the core principles of nationalism while promoting it as the solution to the errors of those other ideologies. They do this from either ignorance or malice. So once again, if you're not a nationalist, if you don't believe in the popular sovereignty and self-determination of a national identity group, then don't call yourself a nationalist. Don't treat nationalism as it is the thing that you are promoting when you're actually promoting theonomy or dominionism or sacralism or something else. I don't want to sound too harsh here, but this, if you're doing this, if you're saying, well, actually, no, the people aren't sovereign, God is sovereign, and you read Romans 13 and First Peter, and you affirm all those different things about how sovereignty works politically, and then you call yourself a nationalist, I think there's something wrong there. And that certainly does need to be resolved. But going further on this topic, those who support Christian nationalism while being ignorant of its definition and implications commit a great act of negligence. Because in affairs as important as affairs of state, government is pretty important, not going to lie there is a reasonable responsibility for discernment, which, when diminished, can occasion a preponderance of evil and invite God's wrath. So let's read Romans 13, 3 through 4. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So, the ruler is a minister of God and has the authority and the power to reward good and punish evil. So there's a lot of stake in politics when we're discussing this issue. Therefore, it is a great responsibility that is certainly put on rulers. Now I'm going to read Isaiah 10, 1 through 4. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. And what will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from afar? To whom will ye flee for help? And where will ye leave your glory? Without me, they shall bow down under the prisoners, and they shall fall under the slain. For all of this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So, if you actually oppose nationalism, but you then support it in decree, then that is a problem, because now you are creating a situation where through your indiscretion you are misleading people and you're giving an appearance of evil. And this is especially important because you have a duty to God as a ruler to do that which is right. And in neglecting that duty, it is problematic for the execution of the goods of statecraft. And so, therefore, it is important that those who make this mistake learn the truth and act accordingly, so that they do not bring their statesmen to confusion regarding what ought to be the basis for good government. So, because of the importance and of the responsibility, they should be able to accurately and correctly describe the ideology which they support. But there is another type of criticism to be made here, because less reputable are the deceivers who invite others with the promise of Christian nationalism while knowing that their ideology does not truly fit the category. Though some may have the intention of furthering an ostensibly superior system, their deception regarding this erodes their integrity and demonstrates an underlying malice in their actions. I'm going to read John 3:20 through 21. Oh, there you go. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God. So therefore, if you're going to support an ideology, you should be honest about which ideology you're supporting. And therefore, it is important for people who aren't Christian nationalists to not take up the label of Christian nationalist, because in doing so, they are being deceptive, because Christian nationalism has a particular meaning. And in knowing the meaning, but denying it, but opposing the necessary consequences of the meaning, but still describing themselves as cohering to the meaning, they are being deceptive. And this is poor for their reputation, because by being deceptive, it makes them untrustworthy. And I will move on from there. It would be better for them to seek a more accurate term by which to describe their views than falsely calling themselves Christian nationalists. Indeed, God values truth and integrity. And I'm going to read Proverbs 12:17 through 22. He that speaketh truth shineth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is that speaketh lie like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of a wise is health. And I've read this earlier, but once again, I do think it is important to emphasize that it is very important to be truthful. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. So if you're not a Christian nationalist, don't call yourself a Christian nationalist. And those who take advantage of the faithful will be punished. So once again, if you're using Christian nationalism in order to actually steer people to something that isn't Christian nationalism, I'm going to be I'm going to say that you will actually invoke God's wrath here. So Matthew 18:1 through 7. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set them in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. And whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. So a lot of people take this passage and they apply it in the context of child abuse. However, while it is true that this is a strong condemnation of child abuse, if that's all you're taking from this, I think you're missing the point. Because Jesus isn't just saying that people who offend children, who do offenses against children, are to be receiving severe punishments. Jesus is saying, he's calling for his disciples to become like little children, and that those disciples who are now become like little children can then enter into the kingdom of heaven. And they need to humble themselves as children. And then in doing so, they become greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then in that context, receiving one such little child, now not only referring to an actual child by age, but someone who has humbled himself and who has become, and who has been converted and who has become a little child, receives Jesus. And then in contrast, someone who offends these little ones which believe in me. So once again, this isn't just talking about children, this is talking about believers. And those people, it would be better that a millstone were hanged around their necks and that they would be drowned in the depths of the sea. Therefore, what I'm saying here is that if you take advantage of the hype of Christian nationalism and you call yourself a Christian nationalist and you try to guide people toward Christian nationalism when you aren't a Christian nationalist and you know that you're not, you are deceiving your brothers in Christ, and God's wrath is manifested against you. Now, of course, I would ask these people to repent and to tell the truth. But of course, there's also false brothers who might do this. And then they have a much more severe wrath coming against them, because if they are not saved, then they will face the eternal damnation. But that rounds out the definition of Christian nationalism. I've talked about what Christian nationalism is, and now I've talked about what it is not. And it is based on these categories that I will now be able to allow for subsequent discussions to be had on this topic. And so I thank you all for watching, and I would like to ask you, if you have any questions, to write them in the comments section below. And once again, my book is available. A link is in the description. If you are interested in helping out with broadening the conversation, feel free to like this video and share it on social media. And if you would like to have updates on future episodes, do subscribe. So anyway, thank you all for watching once again. I've been C.A. Brill, and I will be seeing you all next time. Over and out.